Some of the scariest things that happen to us don't begin with a scream. Sometimes they start with something that feels completely normal. A classmate who seems a little too interested in you. A strange noise in the middle of the night when you are home alone. Or a stranger who keeps appearing in places where they have no reason to be. At first, you tell yourself you are imagining things. You convince yourself it is just a coincidence, until the evidence starts piling up. In tonight's 3 stories, ordinary situations turn into something far more disturbing, leaving 3 people questioning who they can trust, whether they're truly safe, and whether the danger ever really went away. So turn off the lights, lock the door, and listen carefully. Because sometimes the moment you realize something is wrong is already too late. At first, I tried to convince myself I was reading too much into it. Romer started calling on me more often during discussions. If I answered a question, he wouldn't just move on. He'd ask another. Sometimes he'd hold eye contact with me longer than felt normal. Then the questions slowly began drifting away from the material. I noticed it, but I didn't make a big deal out of it. TAs have favorite students. Professors pay more attention to people who participate. There were plenty of harmless explanations, and honestly, I had other things going on. Around the same time, I was getting to know someone else. His name was Luke, and I kept running into him everywhere. Our sorority and his fraternity had a lot of events together, so after a while, seeing him at mixers, parties, and date nights became almost inevitable. Luke was tall, brown-haired, and surprisingly funny without trying too hard. He actually did the reading for our classes, which already put him ahead of most people. And when he made a joke during an awkward moment, it usually landed perfectly. Eventually, he asked me to dinner. I said yes. We went out a few times, and before long we started sleeping together. There wasn't anything complicated about it. I wasn't completely in love with him or anything, but I liked being around him. He was sweet, attentive, and easy to be with. For a while, everything felt normal. Then one afternoon, I saw something that seemed strange. I was walking toward my car after class when I spotted Luke behind the lecture hall. He was standing there smoking a cigarette with Romer. That caught me off guard. I didn't even know Luke smoked. They were talking like they already knew each other, which made it even stranger. Later, when I asked Luke about it, he laughed it off. He told me he was just trying to stay on Romer's good side so he could get through the end of the semester without having to work as hard. I called him pathetic. He laughed and said he'd happily choose pathetic over a bad grade. At the time, I didn't think much more about it. I wish I had. A few weeks later, I was at Luke's place when I noticed his phone lying beside him on the bed. A YouTube video was playing on it. I knew I probably shouldn't look, but curiosity got the better of me. I picked it up and started going through it, expecting to find nothing more interesting than the usual stuff. Instead, I found pictures of myself. A lot of them. Some were completely innocent. There were pictures of me studying, walking to class, or just going about my day, but then I came across others that were much more personal. Some were pictures I'd willingly sent him. Others weren't. I had no memory of taking them, and I certainly didn't remember giving him permission to have them. I wasn't angry at first. I was disturbed. The worst part was that if he'd simply asked me for some of those pictures, I probably wouldn't have cared. But knowing that he'd apparently taken or kept pictures of me without me knowing made my stomach turn. I didn't wake him up. Instead, I put the phone back and went to sleep, trying to convince myself I was overreacting. I never told him I'd looked through his phone. Part of me was embarrassed, and part of me didn't want to admit that I'd snooped in the first place. About a week later, though, I couldn't let it go. After Luke fell asleep, I tried guessing his password. It turned out to be ridiculously easy: his birthday, backwards. This time, I didn't stop at the photos. I went through his messages, his deleted pictures, everything I could find. And that is when I discovered something that completely changed the situation. Luke had been sending those private pictures of me to an unknown number. Not once, not accidentally. He'd been doing it repeatedly for weeks, basically for as long as we'd been seeing each other. I just sat there staring at the screen, barely able to process what I was seeing. My hands were shaking. I started taking pictures of the messages and evidence with my own phone. Then I started crying. Eventually, I couldn't hold it in anymore. I woke Luke up and demanded to know who the number belonged to. His explanation was almost insulting. He claimed the number was connected to a backup phone and said he simply liked keeping copies of everything in case he ever lost his main device. I knew immediately that he was lying. I didn't stick around to hear another excuse. I grabbed my things and walked out. I was completely shattered. What followed was probably the worst week of my life, and I don't want to go into the details. I was embarrassed, angry, frightened, and honestly felt violated in a way I still have trouble putting into words, but eventually the police got involved. And that is when the truth finally came out. The unknown number belonged to Romer. The police got involved and Luke didn't hold out for long. Once they started questioning him, he confessed. The truth was far worse than I'd imagined. Romer had been paying Luke hundreds of dollars, apparently, to send him pictures of me. The arrangement had been going on since the beginning of the semester, possibly even longer. I never learned every detail, and honestly, I don't want to. Luke was expelled from the university. Romer was fired. As far as I remember, there was jail time involved too, but none of it felt like enough. No punishment could undo what had happened or make me feel like I had gotten any real justice. That was more than a year and a half ago. I am a senior now, almost finished with college, and in some ways I am relieved. I've dealt with what happened in my own way, and I don't want to go into those details. For a long time, I thought it was finally behind me. Then, a few weeks ago, I noticed something. A silver sedan had started showing up outside my sorority house late at night. It wasn't there every night, but it appeared often enough that I began paying attention. I never saw anyone get out. And I have no idea who is inside. Maybe it has absolutely nothing to do with Luke or Romer. Maybe I am just being paranoid after everything I've been through, but there is one thing I can't stop thinking about. I moved into the sorority house long after everything happened. So if that car really is connected to them, how would they even know where I live now? I honestly don't know, and that is what scares me the most. 2 weeks ago, something happened in my parents' house that I still can't explain. I am 22, and I still live with my parents in Northern California. And before you picture beaches and palm trees, that is not where I live. We're way out in the woods, in an area where heavy snow is normal and the nearest neighbor is about a 10-minute drive away. I've been skiing my entire life, so the cold has never bothered me. If anything, I like it. Normally, having the house to myself for a weekend would have been perfect. My parents had flown overseas for a wedding in Portugal, and I wasn't invited. Honestly, I didn't care. A couple of days alone sounded pretty great. Our house is nothing unusual. It is a single-story, 3-bedroom place. My parents' bedroom is at one end of the hallway. Mine is at the opposite end. And there is a guest room between us that we mostly use for storage. The living room and kitchen sit in the middle of the house, and the front door opens directly into the living room. I am explaining the layout because it becomes important later. The first night passed without anything unusual happening. I stayed up late and went to bed around 2 in the morning. I fell asleep almost immediately. The second night started the same way. I went to bed around the same time, maybe a little earlier because I was exhausted. Then, sometime in the middle of the night, I suddenly woke up. I had no idea what had disturbed me. My phone was always on airplane mode when I slept, so it couldn't have been a notification. I looked around the room, but at first all I could see was darkness. Then my eyes adjusted, and I noticed my closet door. It was wide open. That might not sound important, but I never leave that door open. It is one of those sliding closet doors that doesn't automatically stay shut, so I always close it before going to sleep. I've done that every night for years. I knew I had closed it. I lay there trying to convince myself that maybe I'd forgotten, but then a different thought started creeping in. What if I hadn't forgotten? What if someone else had opened it? My heart started pounding. I reached over to my nightstand, grabbed my phone, and switched on the flashlight. The second the beam hit the other side of the room, I screamed. There were 2 people standing at the foot of my bed. There were 2 figures standing at the edge of my bed. I couldn't make out their faces before they suddenly moved. The instant the flashlight hit them, they split in opposite directions, almost as if they had been waiting for me to turn on the light. They moved so quickly that I could barely keep the beam on them. Then something hit the floor with a sharp clatter. I didn't have time to figure out what it was. I just started screaming. I don't even remember what I was yelling. I think it was pure panic taking over. Both figures ran for my bedroom door. I heard their footsteps pounding down the hallway, and without even thinking about what I was doing, I jumped out of bed and chased after them. But I was too late. By the time I reached the hallway, I heard the front door slam. I ran into the living room, but whoever they were already gone. I stood there for several seconds, completely frozen. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely think. I tried to slow my breathing and understand what had just happened. Then I realized I was standing in the middle of an empty house with 2 strangers who had just been inside my bedroom. I immediately ran back to my room, locked the door, and called 911. While I waited for the police, I finally turned the light back on and looked around the room. That is when I saw what had made that noise earlier. It was lying on the floor beside my bed. A kitchen knife. One of my mom's kitchen knives. I nearly threw up. Those 2 people hadn't just been standing over me while I slept. One of them had been carrying a knife. If I hadn't woken up when I did, I don't even want to imagine what might have happened. The police arrived roughly 20 minutes later and searched the property from top to bottom. There was no sign of anyone. They took my statement and asked me a bunch of questions. Eventually, one of the officers suggested that I'd probably forgotten to lock the front door. I told him I hadn't. I remembered locking it, but there were no signs of forced entry, and every other door and window in the house was locked. So, according to the officer, the front door had to be how they got in. I didn't agree with him, but there wasn't much else to go on. The police eventually left, and I was still sitting there with the same question running through my head. Even if I'd somehow forgotten to lock the front door, that didn't explain the part that bothered me most. Why were two people standing over my bed with a knife? If they were just there to steal something, why risk waking me up? Why come into my bedroom at all? It has been 2 weeks, and I still don't have an answer. At first, I wondered if they'd known my parents were out of the country. But the more I think about it, the less convincing that explanation seems. Because regular burglars steal things. They don't usually sneak into someone's bedroom in the middle of the night carrying a knife, and that is the part I can't stop thinking about. My name is Natasha, and this started about 3 months ago, shortly after I broke up with my ex Tibbet. I was 23 and had just moved into my first apartment by myself. Until then, I'd always lived with roommates, but I was ready for some privacy. The apartment was a basic one-bedroom in a mid-sized complex in Columbus, Ohio. I worked remotely, so I spent a lot of time at home. One of the biggest reasons I'd wanted my own place was simply to have somewhere quiet to work without roommates making noise in the kitchen while I was on a call. My unit was on the second floor, facing the back of the complex. From my window, there wasn't much to see, just the parking lot and a line of trees. It wasn't exactly a beautiful view, but I didn't care. For the first time, I had my own space, my own routine, and a sense of privacy I'd never really had before. The first few weeks were completely uneventful. I barely interacted with anyone in the building. There was an older woman on the first floor whom I'd occasionally see checking her mail, and there was a couple across the hall who argued loudly enough that I could sometimes hear them through the walls. Other than that, everyone pretty much kept to themselves. Then I started noticing a man. The first time I saw him was about 3 weeks after I moved in. I just finished at the gym and was heading upstairs around 8 that evening when we passed each other on the staircase. He was a pretty ordinary-looking white guy, probably in his late 30s or early 40s. Average build, nothing particularly distinctive about him. He was wearing a gray hoodie. As we passed, we did that awkward little dance where two people move toward the same side before realizing they're both doing it. He eventually squeezed past me without saying anything. I didn't think much of it. A few days later, I saw him again. I was in the parking lot getting something out of my car when I noticed him standing near the dumpsters. He wasn't taking out trash. He wasn't doing anything obvious. He was simply standing there. When I looked directly at him, he turned and walked around the side of the building. Again, it wasn't exactly suspicious, not by itself, so I shrugged it off. Then I saw him a third time, and that is when I started wondering if these weren't coincidences anymore. I was working at my desk one afternoon when I happened to glance through the window. My desk faced the parking lot, so I had a clear view of everything below. A navy blue sedan was parked there. I didn't recognize the car. Someone was sitting in the driver's seat, and although I couldn't see their face clearly, I could tell they were looking toward the apartment building, toward my floor. Maybe even directly at my window. I couldn't be completely sure. I watched for a few seconds before turning back to my work. About 10 minutes later, I looked again. The car was gone. For some reason, that stayed with me. After that, I started paying closer attention, and the more I watched, the more often I seemed to notice the same man. He was around the parking lot surprisingly often. Sometimes he walked through the area. Other times he sat inside that same blue sedan, which I eventually realized belonged to him. Once, I saw him standing near the stairs leading to my building, staring down at his phone. He never openly approached me, he never confronted me, and as far as I knew, he'd never even deliberately spoken to me. But I started noticing something else. He always seemed to position himself somewhere with a clear view of my apartment. I kept telling myself I was being paranoid. The apartment complex wasn't very big. If someone lived there and happened to keep the same hours I did, of course I was going to see them from time to time. And the truth was, I'd never actually caught him doing anything wrong. He wasn't following me. He wasn't trying to talk to me. He was simply there. Then something happened that I couldn't explain away so easily. I had a pretty predictable routine. I went to the same gym around the same time most days, and twice a week I'd usually stop at a Chipotle on my way home. The restaurant was about 15 minutes from my apartment, in a completely different part of town. One evening, I was sitting there alone, eating and scrolling through my phone. I looked up, and there he was. The same man, the same gray hoodie. He was sitting at a table across the restaurant, eating a burrito bowl like this was the most normal thing in the world. My stomach dropped. There was no obvious reason for him to be there. This wasn't somewhere near my apartment. It wasn't close to my gym. It wasn't even on some major route where you could accidentally end up there. You had to deliberately drive to this place. I tried to convince myself it was a coincidence. Chipotle is popular. People eat there. Maybe he'd been there before I'd arrived. Maybe our routines simply overlapped. But then I noticed him looking at me. Not staring, at least not in any obvious way. He'd look down at his food, then glance up at me, then look back down again. I could feel myself becoming more uncomfortable by the second. When I finally decided to leave, he started gathering his things too. That was enough for me. I walked to my car as quickly as I could without actually running. The second I got inside, I locked the doors and sat there for a moment. I looked back toward the restaurant. I couldn't see him through the windows. I had no idea whether he'd already gone outside. I didn't stick around to find out. On the drive home, I kept checking my mirrors. I never saw another car following me, but I still took a strange route home just to be safe. Looking back, it probably sounds excessive, but I wasn't thinking clearly. This man already knew where I lived. That alone was enough to scare me. When I got back to my apartment, I sat in the dark for almost an hour watching the parking lot through my window. I didn't see the blue sedan. I didn't see him. Eventually, I convinced myself that maybe I'd overreacted. Maybe I was letting fear connect dots that weren't actually connected. I finally went to bed. The next morning, though, I looked out the window again. The blue sedan was back, and someone was sitting inside it. I didn't hesitate. I called the police. I felt ridiculous doing it. What was I even supposed to tell them? There's a guy I keep seeing, and he is making me uncomfortable. It sounded weak even to me, but I explained everything anyway. The officer was polite, although it was obvious he wasn't convinced there was much they could do. He said they could send someone to check the parking lot, but unless the man was actually breaking the law, there wasn't much reason for them to intervene. He suggested I start documenting everything, write down the dates, record the times, take pictures whenever I safely could, and if the situation escalated, call again. By the time an officer arrived, roughly 45 minutes later, the blue sedan was gone. He walked around the complex, checked the area, and knocked on a few doors. Nothing turned up. No suspicious person. No complaints from anyone else. Eventually, he gave me his card and told me to call if anything changed. For about a week, nothing did. I started relaxing. Maybe the police visit had scared the guy away, or maybe I'd genuinely been overthinking everything. Then I found the note. It had been pushed underneath my apartment door sometime during the night. I found it the next morning. It was handwritten. There were only 7 words. Asterisk asterisk, you should really close your blinds at night. Asterisk asterisk, I froze. I remember dropping the note because my hands were shaking so badly. Someone had been watching me from outside my apartment, and they knew enough about my habits to know that I left my blinds open. The fear was immediate. It wasn't just the feeling that someone was nearby anymore. Someone had been close enough to my life to notice what I was doing inside my own home. 2 weeks later, I moved out. I didn't wait for the lease to expire. I paid the penalty and left. I thought that was the end of it. I moved back in with my parents temporarily while I looked for another apartment. For a while, nothing happened. Then, about a month later, I was driving home from the gym. It wasn't the same gym anymore. I'd switched to one near my parents' house. I was driving through a random side street when I saw a navy blue sedan parked nearby. I recognized it immediately. It was the same car. I know how that sounds. I know there are thousands of navy blue sedans on the road. But I knew this was the one I'd been seeing outside my apartment. I sped home. I didn't see anyone following me, but somehow that made everything feel worse, because if that really was the same person, and I am almost certain it was, then maybe he didn't need to follow me. Maybe he already knew where I was going. The moment I got inside, I told my parents everything. My dad said he'd keep watch around the house. My mom started checking the locks twice. They've both been much more alert ever since, and my dad even talked about installing a camera near the front porch. It has been about 2 weeks now. I haven't seen the blue sedan again. Part of me wants to believe it was all a coincidence. Maybe it was just another car. Maybe I've been connecting things that were never connected. But I know what I saw, and I still have no idea how that man could have found me after I moved. That is the part I can't get out of my head, because if he really has been following me, then moving away may not have changed anything. And honestly, I am scared to leave the house. I am considering contacting the police again, but I don't know what I could actually tell them beyond what I've already reported. For now, I am just hoping this is the last time I ever have to tell this story.